Of all the jurisdictions in the world, there is one jurisdiction that is following what is happening in Ukraine with special attention, every minute, every day, and that is none other than Taiwan. An island that seems to be ticking all the boxes for becoming the next protagonist of a major international crisis. With the protection of the United States for more than 70 years, Taiwan has lived on the fringes of the Chinese regime, but always with the latent threat that one day Beijing might ultimately try to invade the island. Of course, this hypothesis, this possibility, could trigger a conflict that would go far beyond an armed clash on a regional scale. It would be the first time since the Vietnam War that the US and China could potentially face off in a theatre of operations. Or at least, that's the usual impression one gets, if only from statements like these.
So unlike Ukraine, to be clear, sir, US forces, US men and women, would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
The question is, what could happen if the conflict in Taiwan finally erupts? Would China succeed in taking control of this island? Let's get started. We have mentioned this a lot of times. Taiwan's situation is one of the most ambiguous in international politics, particularly because the sovereignty of this island has undergone constant changes. For example, and this may surprise you, when the Sino-Japanese War of 1895 ended, the Qing Empire ceded the island in perpetuity to Japan. That is, formerly the island of Formosa, Taiwan ceased to be China. And so for the next 50 years, this island was part of the Empire of Japan. Of course, Tokyo's defeat in the Second World War again brought about a turn of events. The island once again became part of the then Republic of China, a country ruled by a military dictatorship and somewhat aligned with the United States. However, when the revolution of Mao Zedong and company succeeded in 1949, the authoritarian regime of the Republic of China was exiled to Taiwan. Since then, the island has been considered by Beijing as a kind of rebel province, an island that is fully autonomous and functions in practice as a sovereign country, but which, however, has never been able to declare its independence. Firstly, because its government considered itself the legitimate government of China, and later because Beijing has said ad nauseum, again and again, that any declaration of independence would be considered an act of war. And so it has been molded in this way, a country that over recent decades has experienced an important economic, technological, and also democratic success. In political and social terms, Taiwan has become the freest territory on the entire Asian continent. The problem, China's appetite is getting bigger and bigger. And if the war in Ukraine has shown us anything, it is that the territorial claims of the major powers are once again a feasible scenario for military conflict. The question is, will Taiwan become the new Ukraine? What would a Chinese invasion of the island look like? Who would be involved and what would be the possible outcomes? Well, stick with me to find out.
2 starting points.
The first thing to keep in mind is that in the hypothesis of a war between the United States and China in Taiwan, both sides have a completely different view of the situation. This reveals some key points to keep in mind. For Beijing, the Taiwan issue is a strictly domestic one. Since the island belongs to the Republic of China, and the Mao Revolution replaced that for the current communist regime, the People's Republic of China, from their point of view, Taiwan is a Chinese province with a de facto degree of special autonomy. In other words, Xi Jinping's government considers that any military operation would not be a clash between countries, but an event relating to China's internal territorial order. And keep in mind that it's this position that explains Beijing's growing belligerence towards any foreign group meddling on the island. They see it as a kind of humiliation, a feeling that has been reinforced by years of communist propaganda.
China's Xi vows reunification with Taiwan.
For its part, however, the United States maintains a commitment to Taiwan that is not entirely compatible with this position. In the Taiwan Relations Act, enacted on 10th of April 1979, the United States made an unwavering commitment to this territory.
The United States shall make available to Taiwan such defense articles and defense services in such quantity as may be necessary to enable Taiwan to maintain sufficient self-defense capabilities. Section 3 of the Taiwan Relations Act.
In other words, the law makes it very clear Taiwan must be able to defend itself against any attempt of aggression, and the United States will be responsible should this situation occur. In fact, there doesn't seem to be much point in talking about Taiwan's defense except with the US. Why? Well, look at this.
David versus Goliath?
first question we have to answer is, if China eventually does decide to invade Taiwan, which countries would be involved in the conflict? And take note, because this is where the key point of US diplomacy comes into play: strategic ambiguity. For years, at least officially, Washington has never made it clear whether or not it would intervene in that possible conflict, and it has not done so in order to create a double deterrent. On the one hand, the latent threat of US intervention could prevent China from deciding to invade the island. On the other hand, the uncertainty also does not allow Taipei to be overly aggressive, for example, by declaring its independence. This is the approach that, according to many analysts, has succeeded in maintaining peace for decades. However, things are evolving. The Chinese military is increasingly prepared, and if the war in Ukraine has made anything clear, it is that the strategy of strategic ambiguity could end up being Xi Jinping's excuse to pounce on his prey. That is to say, if at any given moment top Chinese officials thought that the United States might not come to Taiwan's rescue and may settle, for instance, with the application of sanctions, then that might be the best fuse for unleashing an invasion. This is similar to what happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Putin and his entourage felt that when push came to shove, no one would lift a finger for Kyiv, and that is what explains why Joe Biden has intentionally confused himself. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, making it clear that the United States would come to the aid of its ally.
So unlike Ukraine, to be clear, sir, U.S. forces, U.S. men and women, would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes. I don't want a Cold War with China. I just want to make China understand that we are not going to step back. We are not going to change any of our views.
So are you saying that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China attacked?
Yes, we have a commitment.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
That's the commitment we made.
In other words, Washington has not changed its formal position, but the president wanted to make clear the position of the White House. Perhaps it has a lot to do with the fact that the advanced semiconductor industry has made Taiwan an absolutely strategic enclave for the United States. American companies, American technology, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about artificial intelligence, Amazon, or the F-35, they all need chips made by TSMC. I don't know for certain, but I'm sure that further supports the resolve of the United States. Why is the position of American power so important? Well, basically because American power is Taipei's only asset. Why? We'll take a look. The decorrelation of forces between Taiwan and the People's Republic of China has continued to grow over time. If the Chinese armed forces have traditionally been a poorly equipped, poorly trained, and poorly capable army, the situation is very different today. The People's Republic of China is making an enormous effort to improve its military capabilities, including the launching of 6 new aircraft carriers, 5th-generation fighters, new amphibious capabilities, and thousands of missiles aimed at Taiwan. Yes, it is true that Taiwan concentrates its military spending on protecting a much smaller territory, 36,000 kilometers square, compared to more than 9 million. But China is directing the bulk of its military investments towards maritime dominance in the region, including the ability to invade Taiwan. In fact, the widening gap in forces may be the reason Taiwan has reduced its military effort over the past few decades. The idea is that a China that is more open to the world could eliminate any risk of invasion, and that ultimately everything will depend on the US position is perhaps what explains charts like this one. Now, this is something that could begin to change, but the truth is that without international assistance, Taiwan would have a very difficult time resisting an invasion by China.
China launches the most advanced aircraft carrier on the planet outside the US. China strikes a new military blow with its new aircraft carrier Type 003. Taiwan highly vulnerable to Chinese air attack, leak documents show. Troubling details raise questions about US intelligence agencies' ability to detect a pending invasion and the island's capacity to defend itself.
Now let's suppose that because of X or Y, everything finally goes wrong. Things get out of control and the conflict explodes. What could happen? What would be the balance of forces? Would any of the contenders clearly impose themselves? Well, let's take a look.
War games.
What could happen if war ultimately does break out in Taiwan? It is not such a far-fetched hypothesis, so in Washington it is something they take very, very seriously. Precisely for this reason, several US research and defense centers have carried out simulations to find out how this possible conflict would develop. In virtually all cases, it is taken for granted that US forces would participate. Otherwise, Taiwan's defeat would be certain. Well, let's take, for example, as a starting point, the simulation carried out by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a leading Washington-based think tank. In order to carry out this simulation, all possible air and naval actions were taken into account, as well as all historical precedents with amphibious missions, from Normandy to Okinawa to the Falkland Islands. The results? Well, take a look. In most scenarios, the United States, Taiwan, and Japan would succeed in defeating China's conventional amphibious invasion and maintain Taiwan's autonomy. However, this defense would come at a high cost. The United States and its allies would lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and suffer tens of thousands of casualties. Just think, the US would have to fight thousands of miles away against a Chinese military that would be playing on home soil. For its part, Taiwan's economy would be devastated by the destruction of much of its infrastructure. Of course, China would also suffer great losses, and the failure of the operation could end up destabilizing the Chinese Communist Party government. The results of this simulation show that only when Taiwan is left alone would China succeed in taking control of the island. However, even in this scenario, Taiwanese resistance could extend the invasion by 70 days. Okay, I know what some of you are thinking. There you go again, VisualPolitik, propagandizing for the imperial dominance of Uncle Sam. Well, we're not doing it now, nor have we ever done it before. In fact, these drills are anything but encouraging for the United States. In the simulation, even the best case scenario entails extremely significant losses for the United States and Japan, as well as major economic repercussions. In other words, no matter what the outcome, no one would win. Any Chinese attempt to invade Taiwan would be a disaster for all parties. But that's not all. The results of this simulation warn of 3 more possible risks. Firstly, the damage caused by cyber attacks could cause significant economic and social damage in the United States itself. Secondly, the damage sustained by US military forces could be difficult to replace. Rebuilding capability could take years, while China, a country endowed with greater industrial capacity, could take advantage of such a scenario to turn the tables. It would be something of a Pyrrhic victory for the United States. Thirdly, countries such as Russia, North Korea, and Iran could take advantage of this distraction and drain on US resources to accelerate their political agendas. In other words, even if the United States could avoid Taiwan's annexation today, the potential risks could be very high. Sometimes in war, winning is not everything. History teaches us important lessons in this regard. For example, in 1919, after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, French Marshal Ferdinand Foch expressed his concern about the outcome of the First World War. We've signed a 20-year armistice. The Marshal considered that, despite having won the war, France had been seriously decimated and could be vulnerable to a German rearmament in the not-too-distant future. Well, the simulation suggests that something very similar could happen to the United States. And keep in mind that the consequences of this issue could become much more complex, even without the outbreak of war as we all conceive it. In January 2022, another think tank, the Center for a New American Security, ran a simulation to see what might happen to the semiconductor industry. The results were not optimistic. Similarly, in June 2022, the same think tank also conducted a simulation of how the war might unfold. In this case, just before the invasion, the dilemma facing Beijing would be whether to concentrate exclusively on Taiwan and avoid attacking US forces in the hope that they would stand aside, or, on the other hand, attack the Americans to gain military advantage and try to force a negotiation. The curious thing is that, according to this simulation, in the end, China would choose to attack Taiwan in parallel to an offensive on nearby US bases. And guess what? The Chinese military is known to be training to attack the US fleet. For example, as you can see in these images taken in a desert in Xinjiang province, the Chinese are using targets that recreate Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and other US warships for their military missile training. Is this a huge red flag? In fact, according to the simulations we are discussing, one of China's options would be to avoid attacking Taiwan with missiles so as not to seriously damage its technological industry, and instead detonate a nuclear device in the Pacific to intimidate the Americans and force negotiations. This would also explain the recent rush Xi Jinping seems to be in to build many more nuclear weapons. In other words, if they are really willing to use such a threat, for it to be credible and have an effect, it has to be backed up by the strongest possible force.
China already surpasses the US in ground-based nuclear offensive capability. China already has more ground-based nuclear missile launchers than the United States, although it has not yet surpassed it in total number of nuclear warheads. China likely to have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, Pentagon.
And so, VisualPolitik community, in general, the result of most of the simulations that have been conducted is that the United States would outperform China militarily, but that yes, it would do so by paying an excessively high price for not being sufficiently prepared. And do you know what? This is where the work of Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in pushing defense agreements in the region makes all the sense in the world. It is possible that the best and perhaps only effective way to deter China is for the United States to secure the support of many more contenders: Japan, South Korea, Australia, United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. In other words, that in this case, the US card alone may no longer be enough of a deterrent for China. And this leads directly to another question: what have we learned, and what have we not learned from the Ukrainian experience?
Kyiv's non-lesson and insufficient victory.
One problem with Taiwan's defense is that trying to replicate what has been done in Ukraine to prevent foreign intervention may not be feasible. The geographical situation is completely different. I think you'll be able to see the differences perfectly on these maps. In the Ukrainian war, both the United States and the other NATO allies have sent huge quantities of equipment and supplies by land, something that would be impossible in Taiwan because of its island status. In this case, China could isolate the island for weeks or even months. In fact, on 8th of April, for at least 3 days, the Chinese military rehearsed how to conduct a total encirclement of Taiwan to cut off any possibility of the United States being able to resupply local self-defense forces. It's a strategy that is reinforced by things like this. Check it out.
Current procurement and acquisition plans reveal that in 10 years, the United States will not have significantly more forces to deploy in the region than it has now. The US Navy is modernizing, but it will not have its planned fleet of between 450 and 500 ships until 2045, a fleet size that China will have in just 10 years.
Thus, any attempt to defend Taiwan has to start with the island being prepared to repel an invasion at any time, including having all the ammunition and supplies necessary to resist. For its part, the United States must have the capability to rapidly deploy troops and equipment in or around Taiwan. And do you know what? All of what we're seeing is why Taiwan is becoming the #1 priority for security and defense officials, not only in their own government, but also in the US Congress.
US wargame against Taiwan shows need for decisive action to increase armament. A US congressional wargame simulating a Chinese invasion of Taiwan showed the need to arm the island to the teeth. The US should increase long-range missile production, and companies should prepare for the economic consequences.
But of all this, of the possible plan to try to defend itself against China, we have already covered in several videos here on VisualPolitik, so I'll leave you the links in the description. VisualPolitik viewers, the war in Ukraine has shown us two things: that the unthinkable is perfectly possible, and that the times of great military clashes have not yet been laid to rest in the history books. The US objective is to seek ways to preserve Taiwan's independence, and in general, the military and economic superiority of free countries over any autocracy in the world. But in order to achieve this, it may be absolutely indispensable to enlist strong support and allies. The question is, can Taiwan's de facto independence really be safeguarded? Will China be willing to take up arms? Will the United States succeed in building a grand coalition of free countries willing to defend Taiwan's freedom? Leave your answers in the comments and let's open a debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best. See you next time.